Most people believe it's the badge or the gun that makes a police officer strong. Ethan Cole knew better. For him, strength came in 4 legs and a steady gaze. A dog named Bruno, whose loyalty was deeper than words. On a foggy morning at Seabrook Harbor, Bruno's instincts changed everything. Among the chaos of shouting vendors, clattering knives, and the heavy scent of salt air, Bruno suddenly stopped. His muscles locked, his nose twitched, and he pulled Ethan towards something invisible, something buried in the noise of the harbor. At first, Ethan resisted. He was off duty. It was just a walk. But then came the unmistakable urgency in Bruno's bark, the kind Ethan had learned never to ignore. Within minutes, the officer found himself standing at the gangway of an abandoned cargo ship, with Bruno straining at the lead as if lives depended on it. And he was right. What they uncovered in the damp, rotting hold of that ship wasn't just evidence. It was a child, scared, bound, and waiting for someone to hear the cry no one else had, except a dog who refused to give up. Seabrook Harbor woke with noise, the kind of noise that came not in bursts, but in layers. One voice overlapping another, the gulls wheeling overhead, the steady grind of carts over wet cobblestones, the slap of water against pilings that had known 100 tides. The air carried a sharp bite of salt, mingled with diesel exhaust from idling trucks and the metallic tang of fish just pulled from nets. To most outsiders, it might have felt chaotic, even overwhelming. But for Ethan Cole, the harbor had always offered a strange kind of comfort. He moved slowly down the rows of stalls, hands in the pockets of his jacket, the brim of his cap shading tired eyes. The world often saw him in uniform, stern, deliberate, the kind of officer who didn't waste words. Here, among the smell of shrimp and salt and seaweed, he looked different, softer, though no less watchful. A man whose shoulders carried both duty and the emptiness of a house where laughter no longer lived. The widower's solitude had carved quiet lines around his mouth, but in the market, with his partner at his side, he found a rhythm that steadied him. Bruno trotted beside him, tail sweeping low and easy. At just 4 years old, the German shepherd's frame already carried the broad, muscled weight of experience, but his eyes, warm, keen amber, softened when they met a child's gaze. A little boy with sticky fingers from candied nuts reached out, and Bruno slowed without being asked, lowering his head so the boy's hand brushed the thick fur between his ears. The tail gave a polite wag, not frantic, but measured, as if acknowledging the greeting with quiet dignity. Ethan's lips curved, just faintly, at the sight. He didn't have to tug the leash. Bruno knew how to move in crowds. He sat politely when an older woman bent down with trembling hands to pat his shoulder, and he waited when a fishmonger called out, tossing a scrap of mackerel across the stall for him. Ethan caught Bruno's eye, giving the faintest shake of his head, and the shepherd let the fish lie, ears tilting in mock disappointment that almost made Ethan chuckle. That was Bruno in public, disciplined, composed, a creature built for work, but capable of gentleness. And yet, underneath, there was always that current of alertness, that readiness to pivot in an instant. Ethan trusted it more than his own instincts at times. Maybe because the dog saw what he couldn't, or maybe because trusting Bruno was easier than trusting people. The harbor had its own cadence. Vendors raised cleavers, their blades thudding rhythmically against wood blocks. Knives rasped against whetstones. Piles of ice crackled as buckets were overturned, fish laid out in shimmering rows. Gulls screamed overhead, swooping low enough that children squealed and mothers swatted them away. A man pushed a dolly stacked with crates, the wheels squealing against uneven planks. It was messy, unfiltered, alive. For Ethan, it was a relief from the order of precinct walls and the silence of his kitchen. Since Claire's passing 3 years ago, mornings had stretched out like empty corridors. Rooms too still, chairs too vacant, echoes too sharp. Walking Bruno here gave him something to anchor to, something to remind him that life still moved, still smelled of salt and bread and oil, still rang with voices that had nothing to do with grief. He paused near Martinez's bakery stall, the scent of fresh sourdough drifting warm against the colder tang of the docks. Bruno sat automatically, eyes tracking the line of customers, ears flicking at each burst of laughter. Ethan accepted a paper cup of black coffee from the baker's daughter, her face flushed from the oven's heat. "You spoil him," Ethan said, watching her slip Bruno a small corner of crust. She grinned. "He's too polite to beg, but those eyes, who could say no?" Ethan gave a soft grunt of agreement. Bruno didn't break his gaze from hers until Ethan tapped his leg, a subtle reminder, and then he shifted back, tail brushing the damp boards. The sun had risen higher now, throwing streaks of pale gold across the water, catching on the scales of fish displayed like jewels under melting ice. Ethan sipped his coffee, listening. To anyone else it might have been a jumble of sound, but to him it was like a song with verses that never quite ended. The barked prices, the slap of nets, the gossip traded between vendors. Familiar, steady, safe. He thought of how Claire had loved this market. She'd had a way of lingering over stalls, asking names, collecting stories from the men with weather-creased faces and the women with voices sharp as gulls. He'd always been impatient back then, tugging her along, rolling his eyes at how she could spend 20 minutes hearing about a man's favorite way to smoke herring. Now he found himself slowing in those same places, letting the sound wash over him, as if some piece of her might still be folded into the harbor's noise. Bruno shifted closer, pressing his shoulder lightly against Ethan's leg, a simple, grounding touch. Ethan reached down, brushing his fingers briefly through the thick fur at the dog's neck. "Good boy," he murmured. Across the market, a group of tourists snapped photos of the chaos, pointing at the gulls, the bright slick fish, the shouting vendors. Bruno's ears pricked, but he didn't stir. Discipline held, even in distraction. Ethan admired that steadiness, the kind that didn't waver, no matter how messy the world around became. It was something he wished he could borrow for himself. The morning moved in its unhurried way. Each stall had its rhythm, each vendor his own shout. Ethan let the tide of voices and smells carry him forward, Bruno pacing neatly at his side. For this moment it felt ordinary, peaceful, as if the harbor with all its grit and clamor could hold back the shadows that waited elsewhere. But shadows had a way of finding cracks, and even in the clamor of Seabrook's busiest morning, Bruno's eyes sometimes lifted, not at the fish, not at the gulls, but somewhere farther, as though he could sense a note in the music that Ethan couldn't yet hear. Bruno stopped so abruptly that Ethan nearly spilled the last of his coffee. One moment the shepherd was gliding beside him with that easy, measured trot, tail loose in a rhythm Ethan had come to know as peace. The next, his entire frame locked, shoulders squared, weight balanced forward, tail frozen mid-swing. The leash went taut, leather biting against Ethan's palm. "Bruno," Ethan murmured, glancing down. The dog's ears pitched forward, rigid triangles cutting into the morning light. His nostrils flared, chest expanding in a slow, deliberate inhale that seemed to pull the air apart molecule by molecule. The world around them carried on. Vendors shouted. Gulls dove shrieking at scraps. Knives beat a steady rhythm against wood. But Bruno wasn't listening to any of it. His eyes had gone sharp, fixed not on a person or stall, but somewhere deeper, beyond the line of iced fish and chattering tourists. Ethan frowned, following his gaze. Nothing stood out. Just the familiar clutter of the market, the glint of scales on a tuna head, steam curling from a fryer, a woman laughing too loudly as she haggled over shrimp. "What is it, boy?" he asked, his voice low, calm, the way he'd learned to talk when Bruno shifted into work mode. But Bruno didn't flick an ear, didn't blink, didn't even acknowledge him. It was the kind of stillness Ethan had only seen when the dog had locked on to something at crime scenes. Drugs hidden in the floorboards of a truck, a fugitive's jacket buried under leaves, the faintest trace of blood on a cellar step. And now, here, on what was supposed to be their off-duty Saturday morning walk, Bruno stood as though the air itself had turned hostile. Ethan scanned again, slower this time. A cleaver came down with a wet thud, severing the head of a halibut. The sound rang sharper now, echoing in the space Bruno had hollowed with his silence. He could feel the dog's body humming with tension through the leash, like a wire pulled too tight. "Easy," Ethan whispered, crouching slightly as though to match the dog's posture. His free hand brushed Bruno's back, feeling the coiled muscle beneath fur. No response. The shepherd's focus was absolute, as if some invisible thread had snared him. Ethan exhaled, tried to steady himself. Dogs picked up things people didn't. A change in the wind, the faintest trace of scent, the difference between gulls screaming in hunger and gulls screaming in warning. But sometimes, he reminded himself, they overreacted. A dropped piece of fried fish could light up Bruno's nose with the same intensity as contraband. "You just smell chowder, don't you?" Ethan muttered, trying to soften the moment, though his own voice sounded off to his ears. Too light, too forced. The gulls wheeled above them, white wings cutting through gray sky. Their cries scraped against his nerves, made sharper by the dog's refusal to move. Somewhere close, a radio blared a Spanish ballad, the lyrics tumbling rough against the metallic squeal of a dolly's wheels. The whole harbor pressed in, noisy, cluttered, familiar. And yet standing there, Ethan felt the edges of unease creep in, prickling like cold against the back of his neck. Bruno shifted a single step forward, head lowering, nose cutting the air in quick darts left and right. Not playful curiosity, not hunger. It was that precise, slicing motion Ethan had seen 100 times before. The dog, turning scent into a map, narrowing the world to one invisible path. "Damn it," Ethan muttered under his breath, straightening, his eyes narrowing on the crowd. A man argued loudly at a crab stall, waving a fistful of bills. A child squealed when a gull nearly snatched her cone of fries. A vendor shouted the price of oysters, slamming a shell open for display. All normal, too normal, and that was the problem. Bruno ignored it all. He didn't so much as twitch at the gull that swooped within inches of his head, didn't break stride at the fryer's hiss when oil splattered hot against metal. Ethan's chest tightened. He knew this posture too well. 7 years on the force had taught him to trust the shepherd's instincts. He remembered the first time, a traffic stop that had seemed routine until Bruno bristled, staring hard at the trunk. The driver had been calm, his license clean, but inside the trunk had been 2 rifles, both stolen, one still smelling faintly of gunpowder. Bruno hadn't missed. He never did. Still, Ethan wanted to believe this was different. Wanted it to be nothing more than fish guts and diesel. Because if it wasn't, if Bruno was right, then whatever lurked at the edge of that focus was about to drag Ethan back into a place he hadn't meant to go today. Not here. Not on a morning that had, for once, felt ordinary. "Come on, partner," he said softly, tugging the leash, trying to break the spell. But Bruno's paws planted firm, claws scraping slightly against the damp planks. He gave no resistance, but neither did he follow. His world was locked on something else entirely. Ethan's gaze followed again, slower this time, past the glistening counters, the swinging scales, the ropes thick with salt, toward the older part of the harbor, where tourists rarely wandered and the paint peeled from wood siding. His jaw tightened. He knew that stretch well enough. The wind shifted then, sharp with the scent of diesel. Bruno's chest expanded, nose quivering, as though the smell itself carried meaning. His ears flicked once, then stilled, frozen on the horizon of something Ethan could not yet see. The harbor's rhythm continued all around them. Knives chopping, gulls shrieking, voices rising. But Ethan's attention narrowed to the silence between him and the dog. That silence, more than all the clamor, made his pulse pick up. He crouched slightly, speaking in the voice he reserved for moments when instincts mattered more than orders. "Show me, Bruno." And for the first time that morning, the shepherd moved with purpose. Bruno moved first. Not a tug, not a curious sniff, but a determined lunge that nearly tore the leash from Ethan's grip. The shepherd threaded through the crowd with sudden urgency, his body angled low, every step deliberate. Ethan muttered apologies as he was dragged along, bumping shoulders with tourists, sidestepping crates of shellfish, coffee sloshing forgotten from the paper cup in his hand. "Bruno, heel!" The command came sharp, but the dog didn't so much as flick an ear. His focus was a line drawn tight, stretching beyond the stalls and out toward something Ethan couldn't yet see. Vendors cursed when they were nearly bowled over, the sharp smell of mackerel and fried batter swirling in Ethan's wake. Children squealed, some laughing at the sight of the large dog barreling past, others clinging nervously to their mother's skirts. The chaos of the fish market blurred into background noise as Ethan kept his grip on the leash, boots pounding on damp planks, heart rate rising to match the rhythm of Bruno's drive. By the time the crowd thinned, the sounds shifted. The chatter of bargaining voices fell away. The gulls still circled, but their cries sounded sharper, echoing over water instead of walls. Here, at the edges of the harbor, the air thickened with the heavy perfume of diesel and salt. The boards beneath their feet grew slicker, darker, stained by years of brine. Bruno slowed only when Pier 7 came into view. The dog's stance lowered, head stretching forward, nostrils flaring as though tasting the air itself. Ethan's eyes followed the line of the leash, and then he saw it, the grey mariner. The ship loomed at the pier's end, hulking and skeletal against the slate horizon. Once, maybe, it had carried freight along the coast. Now, its rust-eaten hull sagged against the tide, streaks of brown and red bleeding down weathered steel. Paint clung in faded patches, the name barely legible beneath years of neglect. The Grey Mariner. The letters seemed to ghost across the bow, more memory than mark. Ropes as thick as Ethan's arm creaked with each swell of the water, straining against barnacle-crusted pilings. Chains rattled faintly in the wind, a sound that carried with it the illusion of footsteps where none should be. A gull settled on the deck rail, then lifted again with a startled cry. vanishing into the grey sky, as if the ship had whispered something unsettling into its wings. Ethan's chest tightened. He knew the vessel's reputation. Every harbour had one. The ship that never moved, never got scrapped, never drew workers past its rusting hull. It was said to be dangerous, unfit for trespass. But more than that, it carried stories, rumours whispered by dockhands, a place where addicts holed up, where drifters disappeared, where shadows pooled thicker than the tide itself. Bruno stopped at the base of the gangway, paws planted hard against the boards, ears high, body vibrating with tension. Then he did something that sent a cold shiver through Ethan's spine. He barked, just once. A single, deep sound that thudded into Ethan's chest like a warning bell. Not the playful bark Bruno gave when chasing a ball, not the sharp report of a canine giving command. This bark was lower, heavier, filled with certainty. The kind of bark Ethan had heard when Bruno had once cornered a fugitive behind a collapsed shed. Moments before a knife flashed in the dark. Ethan froze, his hand tightening around the leash. The casual air of the market, the ordinary comfort of a Saturday morning, vanished with that sound. "Jesus, Bruno," he whispered, eyes scanning the still deck of the ship. Nothing moved. The gangway swayed slightly with the tide, its rusted rails clanging faintly. The air carried the smell of algae, of oil long since spilled and dried, of wood swollen with seawater. But beyond the normal decay of abandoned places, Ethan felt something else, an edge, a weight pressing against his senses. Bruno's gaze never wavered. His chest rumbled with the faintest growl, not loud enough to echo, but deep enough to vibrate through the leash. Ethan crouched, lowering himself until his face was level with the shepherd's. The dog's amber eyes cut toward him for the first time since they'd left the market, glowing with urgency, with insistence. "You sure about this?" Ethan asked softly, though the words weren't really for the dog. They were for himself. The silence that answered was louder than the gulls, louder than the creak of rope. Bruno's stillness was an answer all its own. Ethan looked back at the grey mariner. The ship seemed to breathe with the tide, its hull shifting with groans like bones in an old man's joints. It was a place that had been forgotten, left to rot, and yet Bruno stood as if it were the very center of the world. Something was here, something the dog could sense long before Ethan could see. The leash went taut again, a subtle pull, not frantic but insistent. Bruno wanted to go aboard. Ethan exhaled, the breath long and heavy in the salt air. He'd meant for this morning to be simple. A walk, a coffee, a quiet ritual that held back the emptiness of his house for just a little longer. Instead, he stood at the edge of a place no officer walked without reason, and the only reason he had was the dog at his side. He straightened, eyes narrowing on the shadowed gangway. "All right, partner," he murmured. "Show me." Bruno's ears flicked once at the words, then forward again, locked tight on the ship. The world behind them, the laughter of the market, the clang of knives, the ordinary morning, faded into distance. Before them stretched something different. A threshold. One step from casual into ominous, from routine into the unknown. And together, they would cross it. The gangway swayed with each slap of tide against the pier, its rusted hinges whining in protest. Ethan stood at the base, staring up the incline, the ship looming like a carcass of iron and shadow above him. The salt wind pressed against his jacket, carrying with it the heavy smell of diesel and something else, something stagnant, like fruit left too long in a cellar. Bruno didn't hesitate. His front paws braced on the first step, head low, ears stiff, his entire body an arrow pointed at the grey mariner. The leash trembled with the tension of his pull. "Easy," Ethan whispered, his voice sharper than he intended. The sound of it vanished into the open air. Bruno's eyes flicked back at him once, amber catching a glint of daylight, then turned forward again, fixed and unrelenting. Ethan's jaw clenched. He had no warrant, no probable cause beyond a dog's instincts and his own gut, which whispered louder than he wanted to admit. He'd been on this job long enough to know how thin the line could stretch before it snapped. One misstep, and the evidence was tossed. The suspect walked free, and the system turned on itself. He had sworn to the law, sworn to procedure. But Bruno's stance didn't leave room for hesitation. The shepherd's body vibrated with certainty, the same way it had that night behind the burned-out garage when he had tracked a missing girl to a half-collapsed crawlspace. That certainty had saved a life. Ethan still remembered the way Bruno had dug until his paws bled, refusing to quit until he'd unearthed her. And now, here at the base of Pier 7, the same insistence burned in the dog's silence. Ethan's mind twisted between two voices. Trust the law. Trust the dog. He shifted his weight, boots creaking against damp planks. Every fiber of training told him to call it in, wait for backup, push for clearance. But backup meant delay. Backup meant drawing attention, flashing lights, the kind of noise that warned whoever might already be inside. And if Bruno was right, if someone or something was up there, delay could cost more than procedure could repay. Ethan looked at the dog again, at the stiff tail, the rigid shoulders, the way Bruno's nostrils pulsed as though cataloguing every trace in the air. It was no ordinary alert. This was conviction. He cursed under his breath, a sharp exhale through clenched teeth. "All right," he muttered, tugging his jacket tighter. "But this one's on you." The leash went taut as Bruno surged forward, pulling Ethan onto the first step of the gangway. The metal clanged under his boots, slick with salt and rust, groaning as though warning them away. Each rise of the tide knocked the ship against its moorings, a dull thud echoing through the hollow air. Halfway up, Ethan slowed, his senses sharpening in ways training never quite taught, but grief had honed. He listened to the flap of rope against mast, the whistle of wind through corroded railings, the subtle groans of steel bones under strain. But beneath it all, there was another silence, a wrongness that pressed against the noise. Bruno's claws scraped, steady, confident. He didn't pause, didn't falter. The dog moved with a precision that made Ethan's pulse climb. At the top, the deck stretched out before them, vast and broken. Patches of rust bled across steel like wounds. Ropes lay coiled in forgotten heaps, some stiff with salt, others frayed to threads. The air carried a chill that felt different from the sea breeze, a stillness that belonged to enclosed places where light didn't reach. Bruno's head lowered further, nose sweeping side to side. He moved in short bursts, zigzagging, each pause deliberate, each inhale loud enough that Ethan could hear the draw of air in the space between them. The shepherd was working, not curious, not restless, working. Ethan's hand brushed the holster at his side, fingers resting against the cold metal. He hadn't meant to bring a weapon into his Saturday morning, but habit had carried it with him, the way habit carried the weight of badge and grief both. Now, standing on the deck of a ship that breathed like a tomb, he was glad for it. The gangway shifted behind them with a soft creak, a reminder of retreat. He glanced over his shoulder, the fish market a blur of color and sound across the water. It looked impossibly far now, like another world. A place where life bustled, blind to the shadow waiting here. Bruno paused suddenly, body stiffening, his ears tipped forward, his chest expanding with a long, deliberate inhale. Then, without sound, he moved again, pulling Ethan toward the starboard side. The officer's stomach tightened. Each step felt heavier, as if the deck dragged at his boots. He thought of Claire in moments like this. She'd been the one to remind him to listen, not just to noise, but to silence. The world whispers before it screams, she'd told him once. He heard her voice now, carried by the wind, braided into Bruno's steady pull. Ethan's eyes scanned every corner, the rusted winch, the shadowed hatch, the coils of rope where something or someone could hide. His grip on the leash tightened. "Okay, partner," he murmured, voice low, almost reverent. "Show me what you've found." Bruno answered not with sound, but with certainty. He pressed forward, tail rigid, body a line of intention that allowed no turning back. And Ethan followed, the weight of law heavy on his shoulders, the weight of trust heavier still. The moment he stepped deeper onto the deck, the air shifted. The ordinary morning was gone. What remained was tension wound taut as wire, stretched between the silence of the ship and the dog's unerring pull. Whatever waited inside the Grey Mariner had already changed the rhythm of the day. And as Ethan moved with Bruno into its shadow, he knew, whether or not the law approved, there was no retreat. The hatch groaned like a reluctant throat as Ethan forced it open, metal scraping metal, rust flaking down in orange specks that glittered briefly in the weak shaft of daylight. The air that spilled out was colder than the deck, heavy and sour, like a cellar that hadn't been touched in years. The scent hit him in layers, oil clinging to old machinery, seawater trapped in swollen wood, and beneath it something sweeter, riper, wrong, like fruit left to rot in a bowl, sugar gone rancid. Bruno slipped past his legs without hesitation, a shadow moving into shadow. His nails clicked lightly against the steel before finding purchase on the damp boards of the hold. Ethan followed, flashlight beam cutting through suspended motes of dust, slicing across stacked shapes that rose like silent sentinels in the gloom. The cargo hold was a graveyard of forgotten freight. Wooden crates lined the walls, their stenciled markings blurred and smeared by time, letters swallowed by grime. Tarps sagged over piles of debris, the fabric stiff with salt. Chains hung slack from hooks overhead, swaying faintly with the ship's slow breathing. Every sound seemed amplified here, the groan of the hull against the water, the faint drip of condensation falling into unseen puddles, the whisper of the tide pressing in from all sides. Bruno moved in a pattern Ethan recognized, not a straight path, not random, but a purposeful zigzag. His nose worked overtime, drawing in air through quick, sharp inhales. He paused every few steps, head jerking slightly, as though following invisible threads, then shifted course and pressed deeper between the rows of crates. His tail no longer wagged. It held stiff, a rudder for the urgency pulling him forward. Ethan swept the flashlight beam across the walls, across the floor. Shadows stretched and recoiled, each one threatening to shape itself into something more. His free hand hovered near his holster, the familiar weight of his sidearm, a comfort he hadn't wanted to need today. His ears strained against the silence, listening not just for noise, but for the wrongness in noise, the thing that didn't belong. The beam of light caught a smear on the floor near the corner of a crate. Fresh scratches, pale against the darker wood, clawed lines etched deep, as though someone, or something, had dragged fingernails desperately along the surface. Ethan crouched, his heart ticking higher, the stale air pressing against his chest. "Bruno," he whispered, The shepherd was already there, nose jammed against the seam of the crate, body taut with concentration. He pawed once, a single scrape of nails against wood, then stilled, head cocked. Ethan held his breath, tilting his ear closer to the crate's side. At first, there was nothing. Just the sound of the ship, creaks, groans, water slapping against steel. Then, faint and almost swallowed by the belly of the hold, came something else. A rustle. Small, hesitant, like fabric shifting against wood. Ethan's throat tightened. He pressed closer, muscles wired tight. The beam of his flashlight trembled across the grain of the crate. The sound came again, louder this time. A scrape, a hitch of movement. Then, unmistakably, a muffled whimper. The kind of sound that went straight through bone, bypassed thought, and landed hard in the chest. Ethan's pulse spiked. His hand flattened against the crate as though touch could confirm what his ears already knew. "Hey," he said softly, voice stripped of authority, reduced to something human, careful. "Hey, is someone in there?" Silence followed, stretching long, fragile. He glanced at Bruno, whose entire body now pressed against the crate's base, chest low to the ground, as if trying to shield what was inside. The dog gave a low sound, not a bark, not a growl, but something rarer, a note of unease, a trembling hum that Ethan had only heard when Bruno had once found a dying pup on the roadside. His stomach knotted. He pulled back just enough to run a hand along the seam, testing its give. The wood groaned faintly, but the nails held. The crate had been forced shut hard, too deliberate for accident. His jaw tightened. "Okay," he murmured, mostly to himself. His free hand fumbled into his jacket pocket, finding the multi-tool he always carried. He wedged the pry bar end into the seam, muscles flexing as he leaned his weight against it. Metal squealed against wood, the sound shrill in the cavernous hold. Another whimper answered. Quick, frightened. "Easy," Ethan whispered again, his own voice breaking slightly under the weight of it. "It's all right. I'm here." The wood gave with a violent crack, nails shrieking free one by one. He worked quickly now, heart hammering, the flashlight beam shaking across the boards as he pried them wider. Bruno stayed pressed against the crate, his presence steady, unyielding, as though lending his body to the fragile soul inside. The gap widened enough for the beam to cut through. For a breath, the light fell on pale fabric, crumpled shape. Then it caught a pair of eyes, wide, glossed with terror, and young, too young. Ethan swallowed hard, forcing steadiness into his voice. "I see you. You're safe now. I'm going to get you out." The eyes vanished behind a thin blanket, the fabric trembling with each rapid inhale. Another whimper, softer this time, but threaded with desperation. Ethan's chest ached with it. He pressed harder on the pry bar, the wood splintering under his effort. The opening grew, enough for him to angle the light again. A small hand appeared, trembling, clutching the edge of the blanket. Small knuckles pale, nails bitten raw. Bruno lowered his head until his nose brushed the seam, releasing a warm breath that fogged faintly in the cold air. His eyes stayed fixed on the opening, softening, steadying. "Good boy," Ethan whispered to the dog, though the words were meant for the child, too, for anyone who needed them. Another splinter snapped. The crate's face shifted wider. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears as he worked, aware of every second, every breath that filled the hollow dark. The rot of fruit, The tang of oil, the weight of silence pressing from all sides. And beneath it all, the sound that mattered most, the soft, uneven breathing of someone alive. The wood gave one final shriek as Ethan pried it apart, nails snapping, splinters flying across his knuckles. The front panel sagged outward, groaning like a coffin forced open. Cold air spilled from the gap, carrying with it a mix of mildew and something faintly sweet, like candy melted into fabric long ago. His flashlight beam cut inside. At first, he saw only shadows, a blanket curled tight, a tangle of limbs drawn inward. Then, movement. A small hand, trembling, clutching something to a chest so tightly it seemed the object was the only anchor keeping its owner from vanishing. The beam steadied, and there she was, a child, 7, maybe 8. Her eyes were wide, irises ringed with panic, face pale under grime. Her hair clung in limp strands, matted by sweat. A length of rope circled her ankle, tying her to the crate's frame like cargo meant never to move. She clutched a stuffed rabbit so worn its fur had gone bald in patches, the fabric discolored by age and fear. The rabbit's ear was torn, dangling by a few stubborn threads, but she held it as if it were life itself. Ethan's breath caught. For a split second, training and instinct collided with something deeper, more human. This wasn't evidence. This wasn't procedure. This was a child, bound and hidden like contraband. He crouched low, voice soft, stripped of command. "Hey, sweetheart. It's okay. I've got you." The girl flinched, pressing herself back against the crate's wall. Her knees drew tighter, her knuckles whitening around the rabbit. She didn't answer, only stared, eyes glassy, breath quick, a bird cornered and waiting for the next hand to strike. Before Ethan could move closer, Bruno shifted. The shepherd lowered himself onto his belly, pressing his body against the base of the crate. His head angled so his eyes met hers through the splintered opening. No sound, no bark, only a presence. He let out a slow, steady exhale, warm breath fogging faintly in the cold hold. His ears tilted back slightly, softening the sharp lines of his posture. The girl's eyes flicked toward him. Just a flicker, but it was enough. Her breathing hitched, then slowed by a fraction, as though she were measuring herself against his calm. "That's Bruno," Ethan whispered. His throat felt thick, his words weighted. "He's my partner. He's a good listener. Sometimes better than me." The girl's gaze lingered on the dog. She didn't speak, but her grip on the rabbit loosened just enough that Ethan saw her fingers tremble. Ethan moved carefully, wedging the flashlight between his shoulder and chin so both hands could work. He took out his knife, flicking it open with a quiet snap. "I'm just going to cut this rope, all right? No one's going to hurt you." The blade slid against the knot at her ankle, sawing gently. The fibers resisted, then frayed, then snapped free. She flinched at the sound, but didn't pull away. Bruno stayed pressed against the crate, a silent shield. When the last strand fell loose, Ethan sheathed the knife and held out a hand. "You don't have to move yet, but if you're ready, I can get you out of here." For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she lifted her head. The light caught in her eyes again. Blue, but dulled, like glass clouded by ash. She blinked once, twice, and whispered, so faintly, Ethan almost missed it, "Don't let him come back." The words lanced through him. His jaw tightened, but his voice stayed steady. "He's not here now. You're safe. I promise." She didn't answer, only tucked the rabbit under her chin and pressed her face against its battered fur. Ethan slid his arms inside, moving as gently as he could. "I've got you," he said again, voice low, certain. His hands found her shoulders, too small, too thin, and he lifted. She weighed almost nothing, her body limp with exhaustion, but when his chest met hers, she clung. Tiny fingers clutched his collar, desperate, as though she feared he might vanish if she let go. Bruno rose as Ethan stepped back, the dog circling them once, his flank brushing against Ethan's leg, then moving to the girl's side as if to guard her from shadows. She buried her face against Ethan's shoulder, rabbit wedged between them. "It's all right," he murmured into her hair. The scent of dust and fear clung to it, sharp and wrong. "I've got you now. He's not going to touch you again." The hold seemed to breathe heavier around them, groaning as though the ship itself resented giving up its secret. Ethan adjusted his grip, cradling her as he would his own daughter, if life had given him the chance to keep her. A ghost of that ache flared, sharp and familiar, but he shoved it aside. This wasn't about him. This was about the little girl whose heart hammered fast against his chest. Bruno barked once, low, short, not sharp, but resolute. Ethan recognized it immediately. A signal. "Move. Now." He nodded. "We're leaving." The flashlight beam jittered across the stacked crates as he made his way toward the hatch. Bruno pressed close, tail low, but body steady. The girl whimpered once when the ship groaned, but Bruno leaned against her leg, and she stilled. Her tiny hand slid down, fingers burying themselves in his fur. That was when Ethan saw it, the first thread of trust, fragile but real, not given to him, but to the dog. Bruno had broken through where words could not, and maybe that was enough. As they reached the ladder back to the deck, Ethan tightened his grip on her. "Almost there," he said softly. "Just hold on to me. Hold on to Bruno. He won't let you fall." Her voice was nearly lost in the hollow air, but he caught it. One word whispered into his collar as she pressed the rabbit tighter. "Promise?" Ethan's throat burned. "Promise." And with Bruno leading the way, they climbed out of the darkness. The precinct felt different that evening. It wasn't the usual hum of officers trading paperwork or the static chatter of radios. Tonight, the building seemed quieter, as if the walls themselves understood that noise might shatter something fragile that had just been rescued from the dark. Ethan guided Hannah into the juvenile interview room, one of the few spaces softened for children. Instead of harsh steel tables and glaring lights, it held a worn sofa, a carpet the color of seagrass, and shelves stacked with puzzles missing pieces. The room smelled faintly of lavender cleaner, though the scent barely masked the heavier odor clinging to Hannah: mildew, rope, and fear. She moved like a shadow at his side, clutching the stuffed rabbit so tightly it seemed part of her body. A fleece blanket was draped over her shoulders, the kind patterned with bright cartoon dolphins. It looked out of place against her pale, grimy face, but she clung to it the way she clung to the rabbit. Ethan crouched beside her. "You can sit here, Hannah," he said, patting the sofa. She obeyed silently, sinking into the cushions. Her knees drew up to her chest, the blanket swallowing her small frame until only her eyes showed. Wide, restless eyes that scanned every corner, every sound from the hall, as if waiting for chains to rattle back into place. Bruno padded in behind them, nails clicking softly on the tile. He didn't look at Ethan for direction. He didn't need to. The shepherd went straight to the sofa, circling once before lying down with his chest against the base. His head rested on his paws, eyes turned upward toward the girl. He didn't press closer, didn't invade her space. He simply stayed, anchored, steady, present. For a long time, no one spoke. Ethan settled in the chair opposite, hands folded loosely, his own presence as still as he could manage. Silence can be a tool, but here it was something more sacred. He wasn't a detective pressing for answers. He was a man waiting for a child to breathe freely again. Hannah's eyes flicked toward Bruno. Slowly, almost without thought, her small hand slipped from the blanket. Fingers hovered, hesitant, before brushing the fur between his ears. Bruno didn't move. His tail thumped once against the carpet, soft and deliberate, as if to tell her, "I'm here." No rush. The tension in Hannah's shoulders eased by the smallest fraction. Her fingers moved again, stroking him in tiny motions, repetitive and careful. It was the rhythm of someone who had lost control of everything and was trying to find it again, strand by strand, through the feel of fur under her palm. Ethan swallowed the knot in his throat. He'd seen soldiers return from combat with the same look in their eyes. Haunted, fragile, always scanning for the next threat. And he knew sometimes the only bridge back wasn't another human, but a dog. Minutes passed before her voice came. It was barely a thread of sound, muffled by the blanket she held to her mouth. He smelled like candy. Ethan leaned forward, careful not to break the fragile line she had offered. "Candy," he repeated gently. She nodded, her hand still buried in Bruno's fur. "Brown kind." Her voice cracked, so quiet it was almost lost. "Clove." The word lingered in the room like a ghost. Ethan felt it settle in his chest, heavy, sharp. Clove. The detail was strange, specific, and in cases like this, specifics meant truth. "You did so good telling me that," Ethan said softly. "That helps. A lot." Hannah didn't respond. She tucked her chin deeper into the rabbit's head, eyes shimmering but dry. The tears had already been spent somewhere in the dark hold of that ship. What remained was a quiet resolve not to break again. Bruno shifted slightly, nudging her leg with his nose. She exhaled for the first time in minutes, the sound shuddering but real. Her fingers curled tighter into his fur. Ethan stayed quiet, letting the moment breathe. He thought of his late wife, of the way she used to say children opened up like shells. They didn't crack with force. They loosened with warmth. Maybe that was why Bruno had been the first to reach her. Not with questions, just with presence. The girl finally whispered again, eyes never leaving Bruno. "He had keys. I heard them. Always jingling." Ethan kept his expression calm, though his mind snapped to attention. "Keys?" She nodded, a small, sharp motion. Said he was going to the place that hums. Ethan's thoughts flickered immediately to the ice plant, the cold storage facility at the edge of the harbor, humming with compressors and frost. The connection was there, thin but undeniable. He filed it away, careful not to press further yet. "You're very brave, Hannah," he said, his voice low. "You don't have to tell me everything now. You've already told me something very important. Bruno and we're listening." For the first time since she had been lifted from the crate, a faint shift crossed her face. Not a smile, nothing so strong, but a tiny slackening in her jaw, a whisper of belief that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone anymore. Bruno let out a deep sigh, his chest rising and falling against the carpet. Hannah matched it unconsciously, her shoulders lowering with his rhythm. And in that small, quiet room, trust began its slow, fragile bloom. The room had settled into a fragile rhythm. The sound of Hannah's shallow breaths, the whisper of fabric as she clutched the rabbit tighter, the slow, steady sighs from Bruno at her feet. Ethan kept his posture calm, careful not to lean forward too much, as if the very air between them was glass and might shatter with the wrong movement. Then, as if pulled from some memory she'd been holding too long, Hannah whispered again. "He had keys." The words came out like an echo, fragile but deliberate. Her eyes stayed fixed on Bruno's fur as her fingers moved in small circles, almost as though the touch helped anchor her to the present. Ethan softened his voice. "Keys?" She nodded. The blanket slipped a little from her shoulder, revealing a bruise near her collarbone. She pulled it back up quickly, shrinking into its cover. They jingled all the time. He liked the sound. Ethan's throat tightened. A man who made music out of keys wasn't careless. He wanted the child to hear them, to know he was in control. "What kind of keys, Hannah?" he asked gently. Did they look like car keys or house keys? She shook her head, her hair falling forward. "Big ones. Metal. Like—" Her lips pressed together as she thought. Then her small hand lifted, mimicking the shape of something heavy dangling. He said he had them for the place that hums. The words hung in the air like a chill draft through an open door. The place that hums. Ethan's mind clicked through the map of Seabrook Harbor. There were plenty of buildings where machinery ran day and night, but only one that matched the way a child might describe it. A sprawling complex just east of the fish market, looming with its corrugated walls, exhaust fans rattling, and the constant drone of compressors. The Seabrook Ice Plant. His pulse picked up. He'd walked those corridors before during inspections, smelled the ammonia bite in the air, heard the endless humming of the freezing units. To a 7-year-old, it would feel like a monster breathing. He leaned back in his chair, forcing calm into his tone. "You did so good telling me that, Hannah. That helps me understand." Her shoulders twitched as if bracing for scolding, but when none came, she leaned closer to Bruno instead. The shepherd lifted his head, nudging her side with his nose. She let out a thin, shaky exhale and whispered into his fur. "He said the humming keeps secrets." Ethan caught it, every word like ice water down his spine. Whoever had taken her wasn't just hiding a child. He was using the plant as cover, knowing its noise and labyrinth of cold rooms could drown out cries no one else would hear. He rose slowly, pacing to the corner of the room. The fluorescent light above buzzed faintly, and for a moment that sound blended with Hannah's words, the humming becoming real in his ears. He pressed a hand against the cool wall, grounding himself. Behind him, Hannah sank lower into the sofa. Her eyes flicked up once, wary. "You won't make me go back there?" Ethan turned immediately, kneeling so he was eye level with her. His voice was steady, solid. "No, never. You'll never go back there. That's a promise." Her lips trembled, but she nodded once, gripping Bruno's ear as if it were a lifeline. Ethan glanced at the dog. Bruno's gaze was locked on him, unreadable yet firm, as if reminding Ethan of the truth he already knew. The child trusted the dog more than anyone else in the room, and maybe that was exactly how it needed to be. He stood again, adjusting his badge out of habit, though he was still off duty. The place that hums. The detail gnawed at him. If the suspect had keys, that meant access, either a worker, a contractor, or someone who had found a way to bypass security. Either way, it tied a human face to a place where machines never stopped. He needed to move fast, but carefully. One wrong step, and whoever this was could vanish deeper into the harbor's maze, leaving nothing but the faint smell of clove and the echo of keys. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. Sergeant Halpin leaned in, voice low. "Any progress?" Ethan's gaze flicked to Hannah. She'd withdrawn again, face half hidden. "Some," he murmured, careful not to reveal too much in front of her. "We'll talk outside." Halpern nodded, giving Bruno a look of quiet respect before stepping back. Ethan crouched once more by the sofa. "I'm going to step outside for a moment, Hannah." "Bruno will stay with you. He doesn't leave his friends." Her fingers tightened in the shepherd's fur. She didn't answer, but her silence carried the weight of trust, the kind that was just beginning to take root. Ethan let out a breath as he stood. His eyes met Bruno's one last time before leaving the room. "Stay with her," he said softly. Bruno didn't move, but his steady gaze told Ethan what he already knew. The dog understood. As Ethan closed the door behind him, the hum of the precinct blended with the memory of compressors at the ice plant. The lead was thin, but it was real. And somewhere inside that humming labyrinth of ice and shadow, the truth waited. The interview room felt less heavy now, though silence still clung to the corners. A box of crayons sat on the low table, its cardboard edges worn, some colors broken into halves. A sheet of white paper lay in front of Hannah, untouched at first, until Sharon, the victim services coordinator, had gently nudged it closer. "Sometimes," she had whispered, "drawing is easier than talking." Now, Hannah leaned forward, blanket slipping slightly from her shoulders, the stuffed rabbit propped on the armrest like a quiet witness. Her small fingers hovered over the crayons, hesitant, before selecting one. Blue. She pressed it to the page with surprising force, dragging uneven lines across the bottom. A jagged shape took form. Water, restless and deep. She paused, glanced at Bruno, then reached for black. With short, sharp strokes, she drew a boat. Long body, a square cabin, and a line like a scar across the hull. Ethan watched from his chair, trying not to intrude, though his chest tightened with every line. He'd learned long ago that children draw what sears deepest into memory. And this wasn't the doodle of a carefree girl. This was testimony. Next came green. She scrawled a rectangle on one side of the page, adding shapes that looked like tiny snowflakes scattered across it. The strokes were messy, uneven, but unmistakable. The ice plant. Ethan's jaw set. She remembered the humming place well enough to capture it in symbols. Then her hand reached for brown. She drew a row of crooked stalls, squares stacked side by side, and colored them with frantic swipes. The fish market, its chaos distilled into a child's lines, 3 places, a boat, a building with snowflakes, a row of stalls. Her crayons had mapped out what her words couldn't. Hannah stopped, the brown crayon slipping from her hand. She stared at the drawing, lips pressed thin. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his voice calm, careful. "These places. Did he take you there?" Her fingers tightened on the edge of the paper. She didn't speak, but her small chin dipped in the faintest nod. Bruno shifted, rising from the floor. Without a sound, he placed his head on Hannah's knee, eyes tilted upward. The weight of him grounded her. Her shoulders dropped, a fraction of tension bleeding away as she buried her fingers in his fur. The blanket slid to the floor, forgotten, as though the dog himself had become her shield. Ethan exhaled slowly. The realization hit him like the weight of the sea itself. The suspect hadn't acted randomly. He had stations, places woven into the fabric of the harbor, places no one would question, places that hummed and stank of fish and salt until they masked the truth. The boat, the ice plant, the market sheds, 3 points on a map, a triangle of control, and a 7-year-old had walked him straight into its heart. "You did something very brave, Hannah," Ethan said softly. "You showed us his places. That means we can find him. That means he can't hide forever." Her eyes flicked up, uncertain, searching his face for cracks. He let her see only calm, only conviction. He wanted her to believe it, because he needed to believe it himself. Bruno's tail thumped once against the sofa, steady and sure. Hannah gave him a faint, fleeting smile, her fingers stroking between his ears. It was the first glimmer of something lighter than fear, a moment of bond forming in the ruins. Ethan leaned back, heart still heavy, but sharpened by focus. The sketch lay on the table, crude but powerful. A child's map of terror. He would take it, follow it, tear apart every corner of Seabrook Harbor if that's what it required. Because Hannah had trusted them with her fear, and Bruno had shown her what trust felt like in return. In that quiet room, surrounded by broken crayons and a stuffed rabbit with torn ears, the first thread of a new alliance was born. The Seabrook ice plant stood like a fortress at the harbor's edge, its corrugated walls gleaming dull silver under a pale morning sky. The steady thrum of compressors carried across the lot, a low drone most men ignored. To Ethan, walking the gravel with Bruno at his side, it pressed into his bones. The place that hums. Hannah's words wouldn't leave him. The foreman, Elijah Carver, met them at the side door. Broad-shouldered, face weathered by years of salt air, apron stained with grease and meltwater. He smiled briefly at Bruno, then sobered at Ethan's badge. "Nothing to hide here," Carver said, waving them inside. "Just fish and ice. Kid must have been confused. These freezers roar like storms if you stand too close, but nobody hides anything here." Ethan nodded, though his gut disagreed. Children didn't invent details like keys and cloves, and Hannah's wide eyes hadn't been spinning stories. Inside, the cold slapped his face. The ammonia sting hung sharp in the air. Workers moved with practiced rhythm, boots clanging, voices drowned by the roar of compressors. Bruno walked close, ears flicking, nose twitching, reading the currents of scent like a book. His stride slowed as they neared the freezer corridor. "These doors stay locked when not in use," Carver said, irritation creeping into his voice. "Cameras on every dock and hallway, safe as can be." But Bruno stopped at the second door. Frost curled thick around its gasket. He pressed his nose to the seam and growled. Low, certain. Carver frowned. "What's he on about?" Ethan crouched, running a gloved hand across faint scratches etched into the metal. Not where. Deliberate. "Dogs don't make things up." Bruno growled again, deeper, his chest vibrating against the steel. Ethan leaned closer, and beneath the ammonia bite he caught it. Sweet, spicy, unmistakable. Clove. He straightened, his pulse heavy. Hannah hadn't imagined it. The humming place wasn't memory. It was a wound, sealed in frost. Carver shifted uneasily. "It's just a freezer door." "No," Ethan said quietly, resting his hand on Bruno's back. "It's a door to something more." The morning fog still clung to Seabrook Harbor, when Ethan and Bruno stepped back into the heart of the fish market. The stalls were alive with the same chaos as always. Men shouting over prices, gulls circling with greedy eyes, knives flashing against wood as mackerel and flounder were gutted on the spot. The smell of salt and blood rode the air, mixing with the tang of diesel from trucks that idled along the wharf. But for Ethan, the noise was only backdrop. In his hand was the blurred photocopy of the suspect's face, captured from a grainy surveillance angle, features muddied but just enough to stir recognition. In his other hand, the leash. Bruno walked half a step ahead, his body taut, ears pricked, tail stiff with restrained energy. The vendors knew Ethan. Many had seen him before, sometimes in uniform, sometimes off-duty with Bruno at his side. But today, their eyes lingered on the paper he held, and on the dog. Dogs, after all, see what people try to forget. At the first stall, a woman selling haddock shook her head at the photo. Too blurry, could be anyone. The market's full of shadows. But then she paused, her knife tapping against the wood. Though, I do remember someone strange, didn't walk like a fisherman, too soft on his feet, quiet shoes. Ethan's pen hovered over his notebook. When? 2 nights ago, close to closing, bought nothing, just lingered. Her eyes flicked to Bruno, then back. He smelled different too, sweet, not fish, not diesel, like candy. Clove? Ethan asked, his voice low. The woman froze, then nodded once. Yes, that's it, clove. Ethan thanked her and moved on. Bruno's head turned with every voice, every shifting shadow. His ears flicked constantly, forward, then back, his body reading signals in the crowd Ethan couldn't see. At a stall stacked high with shrimp, another vendor leaned across the counter, squinting at the photo. That man, could be him, moved careful, like he didn't want the boards to creak. I remember thinking, those aren't fishermen's steps. Fishermen walk hard, heavy. This one floated. He mimed the motion, his hands drifting. Made me uneasy. Bruno gave a short huff, tugging toward the next row of stalls. Ethan let him guide, trusting the tension in his partner's body more than the blur on the page. Down a narrow aisle where nets hung drying, an old man in a knit cap looked at the photo and frowned. Could be, he muttered, but I smelled him before I saw him. Strong, sharp, like cloves my wife used to stick in oranges at Christmas. Odd smell for a man near fish. Ethan's pen pressed hard against the page. 3 different vendors. Same description, the clove shadow. Bruno stopped suddenly, head snapping toward a shuttered gear stall. The boards leaned against each other, as if hastily stacked, the smell of tar and old rope strong in the air. He edged closer, nose twitching, ears flicking like antennae. Ethan followed his line of sight. His gut tightened. Every step of this narrow path, every vendor's half-remembered words, had been leading here. Bruno's tail was rigid now, his body wound tight as a bowstring. He pressed his nose against the wood, breathing deep, then let out a low growl that vibrated against the planks. The stall was empty, at least to the eye. But to Bruno, it wasn't, and Ethan knew better than to doubt him. He glanced back at the crowded market, voices rising and falling in a chorus of life. Then back at his partner, ears locked forward, every fiber of his body tuned to something hidden just beyond sight. The narrow path was closing in, and Ethan could feel it, every step bringing them closer to the man who walked soft, wore quiet shoes, and smelled of clove. The market thinned as dusk pressed its weight over Seabrook Harbor. Vendors packed fish into bins, Hoses washed blood from wooden planks, and the cries of gulls gave way to the deeper sound of the tide rolling against pilings. Ethan's boots crunched along the narrow gravel path that wound between stalls. Bruno tight at his side. The air smelled of brine and rust, but underneath it all was something else, a tension that made the dog's ears flick and his muscles coil. They reached the gear shed at the far end of the row. It leaned against the seawall like a forgotten relic, its roof sagging, salt-eaten boards patched with plywood. A rusted padlock hung on the front door, but the hinges were loose enough that anyone determined could slip inside. Bruno stopped short. His body went rigid, tail straight, nose tilted toward the side of the shed. He sniffed, then pressed forward, claws scratching lightly against the boards. Ethan followed his gaze and saw it immediately. A sheet of plywood leaning unnaturally, not nailed flush like the rest. It looked placed, not built. Ethan knelt, running a hand along the edge. Dust clung to his gloves, but the faintest trace of movement was there, finger smudges fresh enough to catch. He glanced at Bruno, whose nose was jammed into the seam, inhaling deep. A sharp whine escaped the shepherd's throat, impatient, urgent. "Good boy," Ethan murmured, and with a steady pull he dragged the plywood aside. The smell hit first, stale air tinged with sugar, sweat, and something faintly sour. Inside the narrow cavity behind the panel, shadows shifted under the beam of Ethan's flashlight. The light caught on three things: a crumpled granola bar wrapper, its foil edges torn, an empty plastic bottle, scuffed and clouded with grime, and caught on a nail, a scrap of pink fleece. Ethan froze, his breath shallow. He'd seen that color before, in Hannah's drawing, in the fleece scrap Bruno had uncovered inside the ice plant wall. This wasn't coincidence, it was a breadcrumb trail. Bruno pressed closer, his head ducking into the cavity, nose twitching furiously. His paw raked at the ground, pulling the bottle forward, claws clinking against plastic. The growl that followed was low, steady, vibrating against the boards like a warning drum. Ethan's throat tightened. Whoever had used this space hadn't just passed through, they'd stayed here, hidden in plain sight, no more than a few yards from the bustle of the fish market. He stepped back, pressing the radio on his shoulder. "Dispatch, this is Cole. I've got a possible hideout at the South End gear shed, Pier Row 4. Requesting backup. Secure the perimeter quietly. Repeat, quietly. We may have an active suspect in the vicinity." The radio crackled an acknowledgement, but Ethan's focus stayed fixed on the shed. His pulse hammered, ears tuned to every sound beyond the rush of the tide. Vendors still shouted in the distance, but here it felt too quiet, as if the air itself was holding breath. Bruno sat now, but not in rest. His body was taut, ears pitched forward, eyes burning into the cavity. His silence was louder than any bark. Ethan knew that posture. It meant the dog expected movement, a presence nearby. Ethan scanned the shadows around them. Every corner of the market seemed sharper, darker. Whoever had left those scraps hadn't done so long ago. He imagined the man, soft steps, quiet shoes, slipping through the aisles with his clove-scented trail, hiding just beyond sight while the market lived and breathed around him. Ethan's hand hovered near his holster, but he forced his breathing steady. Panic didn't belong here. Precision did. He crouched again, sliding the scrap of fleece gently into an evidence bag. The pink looked almost luminous under the flashlight, a child's color in a place no child should ever be. His throat tightened. Hannah's voice echoed in his memory. He smelled like candy, brown kind. Clove. Bruno let out a soft chuff, snapping Ethan back. The shepherd's eyes flicked toward the pier beyond the shed, then back at him. A signal, subtle but sure. Not done yet. Ethan clipped the evidence bag to his belt and whispered, "We've got him cornered, partner. Just a matter of time." The plywood leaned forgotten against the wall now, the cavity open like a wound. The evidence was undeniable. The suspect hadn't just brushed through Seabrook Harbor. He had built nests here, burrowed into the life of the market itself. And thanks to Bruno, those nests were being torn open, one by one. The plywood panel still leaned against the shed when it happened. The sound came first, not from the cavity Bruno had uncovered, but from behind Ethan. A shuffle of footsteps, quick and light, cutting through the gravel with purpose. Ethan spun, hand instinctively brushing his holster. The blur of a figure darted from the shadows between stalls. Tall, wiry, a jacket pulled tight, head turned just enough to reveal the blur of a jawline. And then he was gone, running, weaving through the thinning crowd. "Stop! Police!" Ethan's voice cracked across the harbor. But the man didn't falter. Bruno barked once, sharp and piercing. Ethan released the leash. The shepherd launched forward like a bullet fired low to the ground, weaving between crates and nets. His body moved with the precision of years of training, shoulders rolling, eyes locked on the target. The suspect knocked over a stack of baskets, shrimp scattering across wet planks. Vendors shouted, curses mixing with the screech of gulls. Bruno never slowed. He leapt the mess in one bound, claws clicking as he landed, tail streaming like a banner of intent. Ethan sprinted behind, boots pounding against slick boards, lungs burning. The blur of stalls closed around him, fish guts underfoot, ropes dangling, the metallic tang of blood and brine in the air. Ahead, the suspect shoved through a line of customers. A woman screamed as he knocked a bag of haddock from her hands. Bruno threaded through legs and barrels, a streak of black and tan. His growl carried forward, low and certain. "Take him, Bruno!" Ethan shouted. The shepherd surged, closing the distance. He lunged once, jaws snapping inches from the man's sleeve. The suspect jerked free, stumbling, barely catching himself before barreling onward. His foot slipped on a patch of ice, but adrenaline kept him upright. The chase spilled out onto the pier. Boards groaned beneath the pounding of feet, seagulls scattering from the railings. The ocean churned below, waves slapping the pilings with the sound of a warning drum. Ethan's vision tunneled, locked on the suspect's back. Closer. Just a little closer. His fingers stretched out, grazing fabric. He caught the jacket sleeve, gripped it tight. For one heartbeat, the chase ended. Momentum snapped between them, balance shifting. Then the fabric tore. Ethan staggered back, clutching nothing but a scrap of dark cloth in his fist. The suspect twisted, ripping free, eyes flashing with something between fear and triumph. He bolted again, legs pumping, vanishing into the maze of docks beyond the pier. Bruno skidded to a halt at the end of the boards, body braced, barking furiously into the night. The sound echoed across the harbor, rolling with the tide. Ethan doubled over, breath heaving, sweat and salt stinging his eyes. He looked at the torn scrap in his hand. Rough fabric, edges frayed. Proof of contact, but not enough. Not yet. He knelt, pressing the cloth into an evidence bag, his voice low as he clipped it shut. "We'll get him, partner. He's bleeding pieces of himself. We'll gather every one." Bruno stood tall beside him, chest heaving, ears pitched forward toward the shadows where the man had disappeared. His growl faded to silence, but his eyes burned with the same promise Ethan felt in his own bones. The market had gone still, vendors staring, whispers spreading like ripples on water. Somewhere in those shadows, the man with quiet shoes and the smell of cloves still moved. But now he had left a trail behind. And Ethan knew this wasn't the end of the chase. It was only the beginning. The call came just after midnight, when the harbor was quieter than it ever got. The tip was vague. An old dry storage warehouse at Fulton Wharf, lights flickering at odd hours, shadows moving when there shouldn't have been anyone inside. Ethan had heard enough bad leads to be cautious, but the detail that made him listen came last. The caller said they smelled cloves. Now, he moved along the edge of the wharf with Bruno at his side, the boards groaning under their weight. The night was damp, fog rolling low over the water, muffling the world into silence. Even the gulls were absent. The warehouse loomed ahead, a hulking structure with corrugated walls and blacked-out windows. Its loading doors hung crooked, rust streaking down like dried blood. A single bulb burned above the side entrance, throwing a weak cone of light that barely pierced the mist. Bruno's body had changed the moment they stepped onto Fulton Wharf. His ears locked forward, every muscle drawn tight, nose twitching as he tasted the air. Ethan could see it in the dog's eyes, the signal he'd learned to read long ago. Something was here, something wrong. Ethan pressed a hand against the door, easing it open just enough for the dark to spill out. The smell hit him immediately, damp wood, oil, and beneath it, faint but undeniable, the spicy sweet bite of clove. He pulled his flashlight, letting the beam cut across the interior. The place was half empty, pallets stacked in one corner, nets and tarps tossed haphazardly. But the light caught something else near the far wall, a desk. And on it, scattered like cards from a deck, were photographs. Ethan stepped closer, Bruno glued to his side, growl vibrating low in his chest. The photos weren't of landscapes or buildings. They were of children, different ages, different faces, all snapped in hurried light. Some at the market, some on sidewalks, some in schoolyards. Each image carried a number scrawled in black ink across the corner. Ethan's stomach tightened. His fingers brushed one photo gently, the way a man might touch glass over a grave. A girl with braids, no older than Hannah, eyes wide as if she'd felt the lens before she saw it. Beside the photos lay candy wrappers, gold foil, some crumpled, some still neat, as if set down carefully. The imprints of ships' wheels gleamed faintly under the flashlight. The smell of clove was stronger here, clinging to the paper, clinging to the air. Bruno moved ahead, nose pressed to the floor, tail stiff. He stopped at the edge of the desk, eyes fixed on the shadows beyond. His growl deepened, chest vibrating with warning. Ethan froze, his hand drifting to his weapon. He scanned the dark corners, the high rafters, the gaps between pallets. The dog didn't growl at ghosts. If Bruno said someone was near, then someone was near. The silence of the warehouse felt alive now, pressing in like a held breath. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears. He crouched low, whispering to Bruno, "Easy, partner. We've got company." Bruno's gaze never wavered. His body coiled, ready. His signal was clear, sharper than any words. The suspect was close, too close. The silence in the warehouse shattered all at once. From the shadows near the pallets, a figure bolted, thin, wiry, jacket whipping behind him like torn sails. Ethan's flashlight beam caught the flash of his face, sharp angles, eyes wide with the wild desperation of a cornered animal. "Police!" "Stop!" Ethan's voice rang across the cavernous space. The suspect didn't slow. He crashed through a stack of nets, shoving a crate aside, feet pounding across the concrete toward the dockside exit. "Bruno, take him!" The shepherd surged forward, claws scrabbling for traction on the slick floor. His bark split the night, raw and commanding, echoing against the steel walls. Ethan sprinted after them, boots hammering against the ground, lungs burning with the effort. The chase spilled out of the warehouse and onto the open dock. Mist curled around the pilings, the ocean slapping hard against the wood. Sodium lights cast yellow pools across the planks, shadows twisting between them. The suspect zigzagged, searching for escape, but Bruno was relentless, closing the distance with every stride. Ethan watched his partner leap, body stretched in a perfect arc. Bruno hit the man's side with bone-shaking force, driving him down onto the wet boards. The suspect screamed, thrashing, fists flying. "Get him, Bruno!" But the man fought dirty. His boot lashed out, catching Bruno hard in the shoulder. The dog yelped, stumbling back, his paw skidding across the slick dock. For a heartbeat, Ethan's chest clenched, fear sharper than any blade. But Bruno didn't fall. He shook once, teeth bared, eyes locked with unbreakable focus. He lunged again, pinning the man's arm just as Ethan closed the gap. Ethan dropped to his knees, slamming his weight into the struggle. He wrenched the suspect's other arm behind his back, the man grunting as cold steel snapped shut around his wrists. The cuffs clicked home with finality. "Enough," Ethan hissed, breath ragged. "It's over." The man sagged against the dock, chest heaving, face pressed into the wet boards. His voice came out low, mocking even in defeat. "Marcus Hale," he muttered when asked for his name. Ethan frowned, pulling the wallet from his pocket. Inside was an ID card, laminated, stamped, official-looking, too official. Ethan had seen enough fakes to know the signs. The font slightly wrong, the lamination too clean. "This isn't real," Ethan said flatly, tossing the ID back onto the dock. Marcus, if that was even his name, smirked, lips split from the fall. Real enough for most people. Ethan hauled him to his feet, shoving him toward the edge of the dock where patrol cars were already pulling up, lights flashing red and blue through the mist. Officers poured out, weapons ready, but Ethan raised a hand. "He's ours." Cuffs on him. Bruno limped to his side then, favoring his front paw, but holding his head high. Ethan's gut twisted at the sight, but his heart swelled at the same time. Even hurt, the dog had refused to let go. Ethan crouched, brushing his hand through the damp fur along Bruno's neck. "You're all right, partner." "You did good." Bruno leaned into the touch, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, eyes never leaving the man in cuffs. Ethan glanced back at Marcus, whose smirk hadn't faded. If anything, it had sharpened. His words came like a hiss through the fog. "You think this ends with me?" Ethan tightened his grip on the leash, the weight of the torn ID heavy in his mind. Whoever this man was, Marcus Hale, was just another mask. And masks always meant there were more faces hidden behind them. But for now, on the wet boards of Fulton Wharf, Ethan had something solid, steel on wrists, fabric in evidence bags, and a partner who never let go, no matter the cost. The interrogation room was small, square, and bare. Just a table, 2 chairs, and a camera fixed in the corner. The walls were painted a dull gray, the kind of color meant to strip comfort from anyone who sat too long. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee gone stale. Marcus Hale, or whatever his real name was, sat chained to the table. His wrists bore the marks of the cuffs, but he didn't fidget, didn't complain. He leaned back slightly in his chair, posture relaxed, like a man who had been here before and knew exactly how to play the game. His jacket was gone, his shirt damp from the chase on the dock. A bruise darkened the corner of his jaw, courtesy of Bruno's takedown. Ethan sat across from him, a file open but untouched. He'd dealt with men like this before, the kind who carried silence like a weapon, waiting for impatience to crack the cop in front of them. Ethan wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. For a long stretch, neither spoke. The clock on the wall ticked. Outside the two-way glass, Halpern and another detective watched in silence. Bruno sat just beyond the threshold of the door, his shadow visible beneath the crack. Ethan knew the dog wouldn't leave, not while the scent of this man lingered in the air. Finally, Ethan broke the quiet. His voice was low, steady. "Marcus Hale, that's the name on the ID. But it's fake, so let's start again. Who are you, really?" Marcus's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Names are masks, detective. You wear one too. Officer Cole, protector of the harbor. What makes you think mine matters?" Ethan didn't blink. "It matters because children's lives are at stake, and I don't have time for games." Marcus tilted his head, eyes glinting under the fluorescent light. "Children are always at stake. That's what makes it profitable." The words hung heavy in the room. Ethan's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking near his temple. He leaned forward, palms flat on the table. "You want to play philosopher? Fine. But I have your logs, your wrappers, and your face on surveillance. You're going down. The only choice you have now is how hard you hit when you fall." For the first time, Marcus chuckled. It was low, humorless, a sound that scraped the air. He leaned in, chains clinking faintly. "You think I'm the only one?" Ethan stilled. Marcus's smile widened. "You found a shed, a wrapper, a scrap of fleece, little breadcrumbs. You followed them well. But those aren't my secrets. They're just pieces of something bigger, pieces scattered up and down this coast. I'm one tide pool. You haven't seen the ocean." The words crawled under Ethan's skin, but he forced his face to remain calm. "Then, tell me about the ocean." Marcus leaned back again, letting the chair creak beneath him. He tapped his cuffed wrists against the table, rhythmic, almost playful. "Why would I? You'll find out soon enough. You always do. By then, though, it'll be too late for someone else's Hannah." The name, Hannah, struck like a blade. Ethan's chest tightened, the memory of the girl's wide eyes and trembling voice searing through him. Marcus had said it deliberately, a calculated move to watch for cracks. Ethan inhaled slowly, steadying himself. "You slipped up," he said. "You know her name, which means you're closer to this case than you want me to think." Marcus's eyes gleamed. "Or maybe I just listened to the news. Seabrook's a small town. Word travels." It was deflection, but it didn't matter. The truth had already bled through. The door creaked open slightly. Bruno's head appeared, ears pitched forward, eyes locked on the man in the chair. Marcus glanced at him, and for the first time his mask slipped, just an inch. A flicker of unease crossed his features before he smoothed it away. Ethan noticed. He leaned back, voice quiet but cutting. "That dog knows you, smells what you've done. You can mock me all you want, but you can't mock him. And he doesn't forget." Marcus's smirk faltered, just for a second. He dropped his gaze to the table, fingers still tapping. "We'll see," he muttered. Ethan closed the file in front of him with a sharp snap. "Yes, we will." Outside, the hum of the precinct seemed distant, muted. Inside, the interrogation wall had given way, not with confession, but with something just as valuable. Confirmation. Marcus wasn't the end of this. He was the door to something larger, darker, stretching along the coast like a shadow, waiting to swallow more lives. And Ethan, with Bruno at his side, knew they had only just stepped into the storm. The storm swallowed everything. Rain hammered the steel frame of the SUV like gunfire, stinging Ethan's face as he slid out with his weapon raised. The coastal road had become a choke point. Forklift blocking one end, a grey pickup sealing the rear. There was no retreat, no clean exit. Bruno leapt from the back seat the instant the door opened. His paws hit the asphalt with a splash, his hackles high, his chest vibrating with that low, primal growl Ethan had learned to trust. He positioned himself at Ethan's side, eyes locked on the men spilling into the storm. "Police!" Ethan's voice cut through the rain. "On the ground." The first man didn't listen. He wrenched the van's rear doors wide, water cascading off the steel, revealing Marcus inside. Shackled wrists, chains rattling. Marcus sat forward slowly, his expression unreadable, rain dripping into his eyes. Then, just for Ethan, he smiled, that small, cruel curl of the lips. Ethan's finger tightened on the trigger. Movement, left flank. The second attacker emerged from between two stacked containers, something metallic glinting in his hand. Not a gun, a flare. With a sharp crack, crimson light hissed to life, painting the storm in blood-red streaks. "Diversion!" Halpern's voice barked from the trailing unit over comms. The flare arced high and crashed onto the road, sputtering smoke. Through the curtain of red light, more figures appeared, shadows moving with predatory precision. At least 3, maybe more, their forms blurred by rain, but undeniable. The network had come prepared. "Cole, hold position! We're moving in!" Halpern's unit screeched to a stop behind Ethan, doors slamming open, boots pounding wet asphalt. Bruno lunged, dragging Ethan's attention forward. The first attacker had a hand on Marcus's arm, trying to haul him out of the van. Ethan fired. The shot cracked like thunder, striking the steel doorframe inches from the man's shoulder. Sparks spat. The man recoiled, cursing, and Marcus leaned back, the smirk never leaving his face. "Stay in the van!" Ethan shouted, though he knew Marcus wasn't anyone's to command. Bruno tore forward, launching through the storm. His body hit the second attacker mid-sprint, jaws locking on the man's forearm. A scream ripped free as both went down hard, rolling through puddles, the flare's crimson glow reflecting in Bruno's bared teeth. "Contact left!" Ethan yelled, pivoting, firing again. A shadow near the containers staggered back, dropping something that clattered against metal. Not a weapon, bolt cutters. Ethan's gut clenched. They weren't here to kill Marcus. They were here to free him. From the van, Marcus laughed, low, almost drowned by the rain. "You can't dam the tide, Cole," he shouted. His voice carried eerily through the storm, mocking, prophetic. The attacker pinned under Bruno thrashed, but the shepherd held fast, growl rumbling deep as he wrenched the arm away from the man's body. Ethan sprinted forward, boots striking the pavement, closing the distance. He kicked the bolt cutters aside, leveled his weapon on the man's chest. "Don't move!" The man froze, eyes wild with pain, rain plastering his cap to his head. Bruno released only when Ethan ordered, circling back instantly, dripping fur, plastered to muscle, breath steaming. His tail lashed once, sharp, ready for the next strike. Behind them, Halpern's men engaged the others. Muzzle flashes split the storm, bright and violent, echoing across the water. Shouts overlapped with the crash of waves, the grind of tires trying to gain traction on slick asphalt. Ethan spun back toward the van. Too late. Another shadow was already at Marcus's side. A gloved hand gripped the shackles, a key flashing silver in the light. "Bruno!" Ethan barked. The shepherd sprang, his body a blur against the storm. He slammed into the van's step, jaws snapping inches from the rescuer's wrist. The man reeled, dropping the key, shouting as he tumbled backward into the rain. Marcus leaned forward, chains rattling, and whispered through the chaos, "You should have let me go." Ethan fired again, the shot slamming into the asphalt by the fallen man's hand, forcing him to scramble away. Bruno planted himself in the van doorway, teeth bared, chest heaving, a living barricade. Halpern's voice roared through the calm. "Cole, pull him out. We're collapsing the line." Ethan grabbed Marcus by the collar of his prison jumpsuit, yanking him forward against the chains. Marcus didn't resist. He came willingly, eyes gleaming with that same damned smirk, as if he already knew how this ended. The network fighters were breaking. 2 were down, 1 pinned by Halpern's men, the others retreating into the storm toward the shoreline. A signal whistle pierced the rain, sharp and shrill. Retreat call. Whoever was left melted into the mist, swallowed by the storm. The silence afterward was deafening, broken only by the hiss of rain and the ticking of cooling engines. Ethan shoved Marcus against the SUV, hands steady despite the adrenaline still clawing through his veins. Bruno stood guard, muzzle inches from Marcus's leg, the growl still simmering in his chest. Marcus tilted his head, meeting Ethan's gaze through the rain-smeared night. "All this," he murmured, "and you still don't see. You're chasing ghosts, detective. Tonight was nothing but ripples." Ethan slammed the door shut, locking Marcus inside. His knuckles ached from the force. He turned to Bruno, who shook water from his coat, then pressed against Ethan's side, grounding him once again. Halpern approached, soaked through, his jaw tight. "You wanted your net, Cole. You got it. But look around." He gestured at the blood, the broken weapons, the still glowing flare sputtering against wet pavement. That was just a scouting party. Imagine the storm when they come in full. Ethan stared out at the coastline. The waves crashed harder now, pounding against the rocks as if echoing Marcus's prophecy. He laid a hand on Bruno's neck, steadying himself against the only certainty he had left. "They'll come again," Ethan said quietly. "But so will we." Bruno's tail thumped once, slow and resolute, before he turned his gaze back toward the mist, ears pricked for the next sound of the tide. The rain turned the world into a blur of silver streaks and shadows, hammering the steel roof of the van like 1,000 drumbeats. Ethan wrenched the wheel hard, the SUV slewing sideways across the narrow coastal lane. Tires shrieked, water spraying high as the vehicle shuddered to a stop. Headlights cut harsh beams into the storm, slicing across the chaos ahead. Through the frantic sweep of the wipers, Ethan saw them. 2 men in dark jackets, hoods dripping, caps pulled low. One had already torn open the van's rear doors. The other stood guard, pistol half hidden under his coat. Inside the van, Marcus Hale's pale face appeared in the light, his lips curled in a thin smile. Chains rattled as if he already knew freedom was near. "Unit 12 in contact. Hostiles at the van." Ethan's voice ripped through the radio. Halpern's reply came rough, urgent. "Hold the line, Cole. We're closing in." Behind him, Bruno barked savagely from the back seat, body slamming against the cage partition. His muscles quivered with restrained power, each bark a thunderclap, vibrating through Ethan's bones. Ethan's hand hovered over the harness strap. Not yet. Timing mattered. The man at the van yanked harder, dragging Marcus forward. "Move!" he barked. Marcus stumbled, chains clattering, his grin widening even as rain drenched him. Ethan flung open his door, boots splashing into a puddle. The storm struck him like a wall, Diesel fumes, wet iron, gun oil. He leveled his weapon. "Police, drop it!" The gunman hesitated for half a breath, then raised his pistol. The world compressed into a heartbeat. Ethan's pulse hammered. His finger tightened. The second attacker shoved Marcus forward, trying to use him as a shield. Chains tangled at the step. "Bruno, hold!" Ethan barked over his shoulder. The shepherd froze, barking harder, muscles begging for release. The pistol cracked. Sparks spat as the bullet ricocheted off the van's steel frame. Ethan dove behind the SUV's open door, boots slipping across the slick asphalt. "Shots fired! Shots fired!" his radio screamed. The guard pressed forward, gun sweeping. The other man dragged Marcus, almost shoving him face first into the asphalt. Desperation was overtaking discipline. Bruno's growl turned primal. His teeth snapped at the harness. Ethan looked back once, saw the fire in those eyes, and made his choice. "Bruno, go!" The door flew open, as if the storm itself had hurled it. Bruno launched like a missile, a streak of black and tan fury. His paws hit the ground with thunder, muscles a blur of raw intent. The gunman barely had time to turn before Bruno hit him full force. The pistol skittered under the van's wheel. The man's shout drowned in Bruno's snarl as powerful jaws clamped on his arm, dragging him down hard into the asphalt. The second attacker faltered, caught between Marcus's weight and the shepherd's fury. Ethan vaulted from cover, gun steady. "Police, hands where I can see them." The man shoved Marcus toward Ethan, then bolted for the wall of shipping containers. Marcus collapsed in a heap, coughing against the chains, that damned smirk still tugging at his mouth. Ethan swept the pistol farther out of reach with a boot, then pressed his weapon to the pinned attacker's shoulder. "Don't move. He'll tear you apart if I let him." The man froze, chest heaving. Rain ran red where blood mixed with water. Bruno held him pinned, eyes blazing, tail stiff with focus. Halpin's SUV skidded in, backup officers spilling into the storm. Muzzle flashes flared as more figures slipped from the shadows, at least 3. But the officers pressed them hard. Within seconds, the network's strike force was breaking apart, retreating into the storm. A sharp whistle pierced the rain, a signal for retreat. Ethan hauled the first attacker into cuffs, then snapped for Bruno. "Out!" The shepherd released instantly, snapping his jaws once in warning before stepping back. His chest heaved, eyes still locked on the man like a loaded weapon waiting to fire again. "Cole, north side!" Ethan pointed toward the fleeing suspect. 2 officers sprinted into the storm. Ethan hesitated only a second before following, Bruno at his side. The docks had become a labyrinth of water and shadow. Rain hammered corrugated walls, pooled on warped boards, turned every puddle into a mirror of lightning. Ahead, the suspect sprinted, weaving between crates. A pistol gleamed in his hand. "Stop! Police!" Ethan shouted. The man didn't flinch. Bruno exploded forward. Ethan barely got the release command out before the shepherd launched, his body cutting through the storm like an arrow. The suspect turned, gun half raised, too slow. Bruno struck his chest with brutal force. The weapon flew into the shadows, swallowed by rushing water. Both crashed into a pile of crates that shattered on impact. The man screamed as Bruno locked on his arm, dragging him sideways. Rain streamed down the shepherd's face, his growl vibrating low, steady, primal. Ethan sprinted in, kicking the pistol further into the gutter. He pressed his muzzle against the man's shoulder. "Don't move!" The suspect froze. "Get him off me!" he cried, pain raw in his voice. "Out!" Ethan commanded. Bruno released instantly, crouched low, ready to strike again. Ethan cuffed the man against the boards, pressing a knee into his spine. Halpern's team arrived, flashlights cutting through rain. "Got him?" Ethan hauled the suspect upright. "Yeah." "Thanks to Bruno." The man spat blood and rainwater. "You think this ends with me? You don't even know what's coming." Ethan forced him against the wall, voice iron. "Maybe not. But tonight, you're done." Bruno pressed against Ethan's leg, steady and watchful. By dawn, the storm had broken. At the precinct, Marcus sat shackled at the interrogation table, wet hair plastered to his forehead. The smirk was gone. Rage simmered instead. He tugged once at the cuffs, then leaned back. "Idiots," he muttered. "One job and they botched it." Ethan and Bruno watched from the observation room. The shepherd sat tall, gaze unblinking, ears angled forward. He didn't growl, just stared, as if memorizing Marcus's every move. Halpern slid a folder across. Inside were photos, boots caked with reddish-brown mud, identical to samples from the market shed and the gray mariner's hold. "That ties them to both scenes," Ethan said. "Enough for charges," Halpern replied. "But you saw it too. That ambush wasn't about freeing him. It was a message." Inside, Marcus suddenly laughed, sharp and hollow. "You think you've stopped something? This was nothing but ripples. The tide's still coming." Ethan clenched his jaw, resisting the bait. He laid a hand on Bruno's harness instead, grounding himself in that steady warmth. That evening, at the crisis center, Hannah sat curled in a fleece blanket, clutching her rabbit toy. When Ethan entered with Bruno, her eyes went wide. "Bruno," she whispered. The shepherd padded forward, slow, careful. He lowered his head until it was level with her small hands. She extended the rabbit. "Do you remember?" Bruno touched it with his nose, then licked it once, gentle as a breath. Hannah let out a sound, between a laugh and a sob. For the first time, her shoulders eased. She buried her face against the toy, one hand tangling in Bruno's damp fur. Ethan sat across from her, chest tight. "You're safe," he said softly. "They can't hurt you now." She didn't answer him. She just whispered into Bruno's fur. "Because he found me." Ethan swallowed hard. He reached down, running a hand over Bruno's head. "Yeah," he murmured, "because he found you." Later, outside under a drizzle, Ethan leaned against the porch rail, phone pressed to his ear as Halpern updated him. Charges filed. Evidence logged. A notebook pulled from Marcus's belongings, names, dates, and one phrase circled in red ink: "The Tide Corridor." Ethan closed the phone, staring at the wet horizon. The sea churned dark and restless, as if holding secrets. He crouched, pressing his forehead briefly against Bruno's. "We'll keep going, partner," he whispered. "One step at a time. For her. For the others." Bruno huffed softly, tail sweeping once against the boards. A promise in the rain. The playroom at the crisis center was hushed, as though the storm had wrung the sound out of everything. Sunlight pressed weakly against the rain-streaked windows, pale and uncertain. On the carpet, crayons lay scattered in a half-circle, their paper sleeves torn, their tips worn to stubs. Hannah sat cross-legged at a low wooden table, a blanket patterned with faded stars draped around her shoulders. She clutched a blue crayon so tightly it looked as if it might snap. Each stroke she dragged across the paper, rasped like sandpaper, jagged and raw. Ethan stood in the doorway, arms folded. Bruno pressed steady against his leg. The shepherd didn't blink, didn't shift. He watched Hannah the way he had watched the grey mariners hold, the way he had trailed men through the storm. Patient, unshakable, waiting for what others missed. The counselor knelt nearby, offering a fresh sheet. "Draw whatever helps, sweetheart. Anything you remember." Hannah said nothing. Her head dipped, hair curtaining her face, and the crayons scraped harder. Minutes passed before she pushed the paper forward. Ethan crouched closer. A black-hulled boat, white trim, its sharp prow cut across the page like a knife. She snatched a red crayon, circling it furiously until the wax snapped in her fist. Without a sound, she picked up the stub and kept going. "That's the boat, isn't it?" Ethan asked softly. Hannah's lips pressed thin, but she nodded. Next came brown, a lumpy bag sketched on the deck. She pressed until the paper tore, her breath coming shallow. Then she reached under her blanket and placed something on the table. A crumpled gold foil wrapper, its ship's wheel emblem still visible. Ethan's chest tightened. "Clove," Hannah whispered. "He smelled like clove." Bruno stepped forward, lowering his nose to the wrapper. He inhaled sharply, then again, as though fixing the scent in memory. Hannah's hand twisted the blanket tighter. She switched to grey. Careful, deliberate strokes formed a ring of keys. She circled them twice. "He had these," she murmured. "They jingled when he laughed." Her voice cracked, and the pencil snapped in her grip. The counselor reached for her, but Hannah pulled back, clutching the drawing. For a long moment, the room froze. Then, Bruno shifted. He crawled across the carpet and laid his head gently on her knee. His fur brushed her fingers, warm, steady. The paper slid from her grasp. Her hand found Bruno's head, curling into his damp coat. Her breathing slowed. "He told me to get in," she whispered. Her eyes glistened. "But Bruno heard me first." The words cut through Ethan sharper than any evidence bag could. It wasn't chance. It wasn't luck. Instinct had saved her. Bruno had chosen her. Ethan slid the drawing back onto the table. The boat, the bag, the keys. Together, not fragments, but a map. "You did good, Hannah," he said, voice steady. "This helps us find the others." Her grip on the rabbit toy tightened. But when she looked up, trust flickered faintly in her eyes. Bruno's tail tapped once against the carpet, a vow in silence. The rain had thinned to mist when Ethan's radio cracked alive. "Unit 7 to call possible match. Black and white skiff found at Seabrook Fuel Depot. Registration stripped. Requesting immediate confirmation." Ethan straightened. Bruno was already on his paws, ears pricked. "Copy. On my way." The depot crouched at the harbor's edge, rows of rusting fuel tanks towering over the dock. Diesel clung to the air like a second skin. The patrol's searchlight shone on a small skiff moored in the back slip, half submerged, as though someone had wanted it forgotten. Black hull, white trim, scarred paint. The match was exact. Hannah's drawing come to life. Ethan stepped onto the creaking deck. Bruno swept the corners, body tense, tail stiff. A faint scent of clove clung to the damp boards. "Check this," a patrolman muttered. He handed Ethan a scrap pulled from beneath a seat, pink fleece torn at the edges. Ethan's gut twisted. Near the prow lay candy wrappers, glinting wet in the beam. The same gold foil, the same emblem. Ethan picked one up, his gloves slick with rain. Bruno froze. Nose pressed to the console, he pawed at a gap. Ethan reached in and pulled out a prepaid phone, cheap plastic, condensation fogging the screen. It vibrated. The shrill ringtone shattered the dock's silence. Every man stiffened. Even Bruno growled low, hackles prickling. Ethan glanced at the patrolman, then thumbed the answer. Cole. Static hissed. A voice oozed through, distorted, mechanical. You have something of ours. Ethan's jaw tightened. Who is this? A pause. Rain hissed against the receiver, then, trade. Him for what you want. You know where to find us. The line went dead. Ethan stood with the phone heavy in his hand, the black water beside the skiff rippling his reflection. This wasn't a scattered crew. This was a network bold enough to call while one of their own sat chained. Bruno pressed against his leg, eyes sharp, ears flicking toward the fog. Ethan set a hand on his head. Not on my watch. At the precinct, Marcus Hale sat shackled in the interrogation room, his cuffs gleaming under fluorescent light. His smirk returned the instant the prepaid phone was placed on the table. You answered, he said, voice soft, mocking. That means they know you're listening, which means you're already too late. Ethan leaned forward, his voice steady. No, it means you slipped, and they just told me where to find them. Marcus's smile widened, but his eyes flickered, just for a breath, the mask cracking. From behind Ethan, Bruno growled, low, steady, certain. The storm had passed, but the precinct still hummed with unease. Past midnight, the squad room buzzed faintly with keyboards and the hum of lights. Ethan pushed into his office, Bruno at his side. Damp fur filled the room with a musky warmth. On the desk sat a yellowed photograph of Claire, his wife. She was caught mid-laugh, hair tousled by wind at some forgotten picnic. Her words drifted back, as if the storm had carried them home. Dogs see what we miss. Ethan sank into the chair, staring at the photo. He remembered dismissing her faith in Bruno years ago. She had only smiled, certain. One day you'll understand. He looked down at Bruno. The shepherd lay by the door, eyes half-lidded but sharp, every twitch of his ears tuned to the world beyond. You saw Hannah before I did, Ethan whispered. You led me to her. If I'd ignored you. He couldn't finish. Bruno lifted his head, amber eyes meeting his. The silence stretched, heavy, grounding, not empty, but full of understanding. Ethan leaned forward, voice firm now. I won't let her down. Not Hannah. Not any of them. Whatever this network is, whoever's pulling the strings, they don't get to win. Not while we're breathing. Bruno pushed to his feet and pressed his head against Ethan's knee, a huff of air warm against the silence. Ethan dropped a hand to his fur, anchoring himself in the steady rhythm beneath. Outside, thunder rumbled far at sea. On his desk lay a folder Halpern had left. Inside, seized from Marcus's belongings, was a single page from a weather-stained notebook. A phrase circled twice in black ink. The Tide Corridor. Ethan stared at it, the words heavy with promise and threat. He whispered one last vow, not just to himself, but to Claire. We'll keep looking. We'll see what others miss. And we'll bring them home. Bruno's tail thumped once against the floor. A promise punctuating a prayer. The harbor at night carried a weight that daylight could never soften. The market stalls stood empty, their awnings sagging with dampness, the air heavy with the residue of fish and diesel. Lanterns and floodlights that usually bathed the docks in chaotic brightness were dimmed now, leaving the pier in half-shadow, as if the sea itself wanted to keep its secrets. Ethan walked slowly along Pier 7, the creak of his boots on the planks echoing louder than he expected. Each step felt like trespassing on the memory of what had been found here. His hands stayed tucked deep in his coat pockets, though the chill biting at his knuckles wasn't from the wind alone. Bruno padded silently beside him, head low at first, nose brushing the boards as if each crevice might hold a clue. Then, as they drew near the mooring post, where the grey mariner had once rocked in silence, the shepherd stiffened. He stopped abruptly, lifting his head into the night air. Ethan followed his gaze. The pier stretched out into the black water, its edges frayed by years of salt and storms. Beyond, the tide slapped gently against hulls, steady and relentless. But there were no gulls tonight. None of the usual shrieks or wing beats, only silence, thick and pressing. Bruno's ears locked forward, his body rigid, every muscle taut with attention. His nose flared, drawing in the invisible threads of scent the night carried. He sat back on his haunches, not in relaxation, but in focus. A sentry, at the edge of something unseen. Ethan crouched beside him, eyes narrowing. "You still smell it, don't you?" he whispered. The shepherd didn't glance at him, didn't move. His nose twitched once, twice. A low huff escaped him, not a growl, but acknowledgement. Ethan leaned on his knees, letting the sea air hit him full in the face. The brine carried more than salt. There was a faint trace of something else, something almost sweet and acrid at once. Clove. Even now, faint but undeniable. Memories pressed in, the crate scratched from the inside. Hannah's muffled whimper, the way Bruno had pressed his body against the wood as if to shield her even before she was free. He could still see the flash of her crayon drawing, the jagged lines of the boat circled in red, the bag of candies colored in until the paper nearly tore. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, the tide's rhythm filling his ears. Claire's words whispered again in memory. "Dogs, see what we miss." When he opened his eyes, Bruno had shifted forward, paws placed firmly at the pier's edge, nose stretched into the night wind. His tail was still, his body locked with the certainty of an animal that didn't know how to lie. "They were here," Ethan murmured. "They're still close." Bruno glanced back at him then, a quick flash of amber eyes, before returning his gaze to the horizon. Ethan swore the look carried something deeper than instinct. It was resolve. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of wet rope and old wood. The mooring lines creaked faintly where ships rocked in their slips, their groans sounding almost human in the hush. Ethan pushed himself back to his feet, standing beside Bruno, his shoulders squared. "This pier isn't just where it started," he said quietly, as though speaking to the night itself. "It's where it's going to end." Bruno let out a short, sharp huff, an answer. The silence stretched, filled only by the slap of tide against the hull and the faint groan of timbers. But in that silence lay more than emptiness. It was anticipation, the sense of something unfinished, waiting to surface. Ethan rested a hand on Bruno's head, grounding himself in the shepherd's steady presence. "Tomorrow," he promised, voice firm, despite the weight pressing down on him. "We close this, for Hannah, for the others." Bruno leaned slightly into the touch, eyes fixed forward, ears still locked to the night. The pier, the tide, the silence, they were no longer just remnants of the past. They were the threshold of what was still to come. The squad room was nearly empty by the time Ethan spread the maps across the conference table. The overhead light buzzed faintly, casting pale yellow circles across the paper, while shadows clung to the corners of the room. Outside, the harbor fog pressed against the windows, like a living thing. Bruno lay stretched out nearby, his chin on his paws, eyes tracking Ethan's every movement. He seemed calm, but Ethan knew better. The shepherd's tail flicked once every so often, the faintest sign of unease, an echo of something unsettled in the air. Ethan traced a finger across the map, circling the first point, Pier 7, where the grey mariner had rotted against its mooring lines. A place of secrets, where Hannah's whimpers had first broken through the silence. He marked it in red ink, his hand pressing harder than necessary. The second circle fell on the Seabrook ice plant. He remembered the frost-lined panels, the scraps of fleece hidden in insulation, the clove smell still sharp in his nostrils. Another point of control, another wound in the city's body. The third mark landed on the shed behind the market. Small, easy to overlook, but packed with crumbs of truth, wrappers, fleece scraps, and the echo of feet that had moved too carefully, too quietly. When he leaned back, the three circles stared back at him from the map, like eyes watching in the dim light. He drew lines between them, his pen scratching across the paper, connecting the points until the shape revealed itself. A triangle, sharp and deliberate. Bruno lifted his head, ears pricking at the sound. Ethan exhaled, his breath heavy in the silence. "It wasn't random," he said aloud, though only Bruno listened. "They built it this way, ship, plant, shed, a triangle of control." The realization struck with a cold weight. Each point wasn't just a hiding place. Together, they formed a network, a system of movement and storage that only someone deeply familiar with the harbor could design. Whoever ran this had eyes on the water, ears in the market, and shadows in the warehouses. He pushed back from the table, pacing slowly, the words shaping themselves in his mind. The ship for holding, the plant for storage, the shed for passage, each piece supporting the other. If one fell, the others covered. That's how they stayed invisible. Bruno shifted upright now, tail brushing the floor, eyes following Ethan's every step. The shepherd huffed once, as if urging him to continue. Ethan stopped, his hands braced on the table. Hannah's face filled his thoughts, the way she clutched her rabbit toy, the way her hand had trembled when she drew the skiff in red crayon. She was safe now, asleep at the crisis center under a blanket of stars. But her words echoed like a plea. "He told me to get in." But Bruno heard me first. Hannah was safe, yes, but she wasn't the only one. The network had been built for more than one child. Ethan stared at the triangle again, his chest tightening. If they built a system, it means there are others. Others moved through these points. Others are still out there. The weight of it settled into him like a stone sinking in water. For every scrap of fleece, for every candy wrapper, there could be another Hannah, waiting in silence, unseen, unheard. Bruno whined softly, breaking the heaviness. Ethan dropped to one knee beside him, his hand finding the shepherd's damp fur. The dog leaned into the touch, solid and warm, grounding him in the storm of thoughts. "You knew," Ethan murmured. "You felt it before I did, and now we know what this really is. We can't stop here." Bruno pressed his muzzle briefly against Ethan's hand, then looked back toward the map on the table. His ears locked forward again, as if even he could sense that the battle wasn't finished. Ethan rose, squaring his shoulders. The fatigue in his bones was real, but so was the fire rekindling in his chest. Hannah's rescue hadn't been the end. It had only been the first break in a much larger chain. He glanced once more at the map, the triangle sharp against the pale paper, lines pointing outward into the unknown. His voice came low but certain. Hannah is safe, but others may not be. We will finish this. Bruno's tail thumped once against the chair leg, steady and sure, like the sound of a gavel sealing a vow. The circle of 3 had been drawn, and with it, the path forward. The night had finally stilled. The storm had rolled out to sea, leaving only damp earth and the smell of rain clinging to the town. Ethan sat on the porch of his small house, the wood beneath him creaking as he leaned back into the old chair. The street was quiet, the kind of quiet that only came after chaos, fragile, precious, like glass balanced on a ledge. Bruno lay at his feet, stretched out with his head resting on Ethan's boot. The shepherd's chest rose and fell in slow rhythm, his ears flicking now and then at distant sounds, the hum of a passing car, the faint bark of a neighborhood dog, the whisper of wind in the trees. But mostly, he was still, a steady presence. Ethan let his gaze drift across the yard, where raindrops clung to blades of grass like tiny stars. His body ached, his mind burned with exhaustion. But it was a weight he welcomed. It meant the day was done. It meant Hannah was safe. His thoughts circled back to her, small, silent, clutching her rabbit, as though the frayed toy could hold back the world. She had survived something no child should ever know, and she had whispered the truth that still echoed in him. He told me to get in. But Bruno heard me first. Ethan reached down, running his hand across Bruno's fur. The dog stirred only enough to press closer, tail brushing once against the porch. That quiet bond said more than words could. They had faced the darkness together and dragged at least one soul back into the light. He exhaled slowly, looking past the streetlights to where the harbor lay hidden in the dark. The image of the map burned in his mind. The triangle of control, the system built with precision and cruelty. One child saved, yes. One network disrupted. But the lines on that map still pointed outward, to others unseen. The fight was far from over. Claire's voice drifted back to him, faint, but clear, the way memory sometimes surprises the tired heart. Dogs see what we miss. She had been right. Bruno had smelled danger long before Ethan even knew it was there. He had pulled Ethan through alleys and storms, down paths that the law alone couldn't find. Without him, Hannah would still be a name lost in the shadows. Ethan tightened his grip on the shepherd's fur, whispering into the still night. "We're not done, partner. Not until the rest of them are safe." Bruno shifted, lifting his head. He looked at Ethan for a long moment, amber eyes glinting under the porch light. Then he let out a soft huff, as though giving his answer. Ethan smiled faintly, tired but certain. He leaned back again, letting the night wrap around them both. For now, this quiet belonged to them, to man and dog, scarred by storms, but bound by something unshakable. The world beyond still held danger. But here, in the hush of the porch, there was peace. And in the steady presence at his feet, there was promise. Ethan looked into the dark, his voice carrying the weight of the question not just to himself, but to anyone willing to listen. "Do you believe dogs sense danger long before we do?" The night gave no answer. But Bruno's steady breathing filled the silence, and that was enough. Sometimes, stories like this remind us of the quiet truths we already know in our hearts, that the love of a dog is steady, unshaken, and often more healing than words could ever be. German Shepherds, with their courage and loyalty, show us what it means to stand by someone's side no matter the storm. They don't ask for much, just a place to belong and someone to believe in them. If you've ever looked into your dog's eyes and felt that wordless bond, you know how powerful it is. And if you'd like to explore ways to deepen that connection, whether through training, understanding their instincts, or simply learning how to listen better, I've found a gentle resource that might help. I'll leave it here, and you can take a look if it feels right for you. In the end, it's not about commands or routines. It's about trust, loyalty, and the comfort of knowing that, in a world full of noise, you and your dog will always understand each other in the quiet. Maybe that's the greatest gift they give us, the reminder that love doesn't always need words.